afternoon. You're with The Pulse tonight. I'm Stephen Curtis, live for you from Sandton, where the Judicial Service Commission hearings into who will be our next Chief Justice are well underway. The person in the hot seat throughout the day from early this morning is Judge Mbuyiseli Madlanga, still answering questions as we speak. Well, Erin Bates is a legal writer for Business Day. She joins us now. She's been watching with us through the day. Erin, good afternoon. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming in. Obviously, there's the huge issue keeps coming back to how does the judiciary deal with criticism. You saw Dan Mafora in that chair. He was answering the same question. And I suppose, in a way, it does go back to whether the acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo did the correct thing in responding to Minister Lindiwe Sisulu. I was making the point, you saw us make it, that surely Judge Madlanga was a part of that decision.
Well, Stephen, I'm so glad you asked that question, because it's kind of what I asked Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo when he did that public address. It was the question, was this an executive decision that you simply took on your own as acting chief, or was there consultation with other judges? And Zondo's answer at the time was that indeed he had consulted with the heads of court around the country and with his fellow justices on the Constitutional Court bench. And of course that would have included Mbuyiseli Madlanga. So there's your answer. The question, of course, now is how much consultation there was, what was Madlanga's position. And I think also interesting, Stephen, just to note, of course, there was that very sort of controversial stoking column from the minister, but there have been other litigants, in fact, the former head of state, who've been as egregious, if not more so, in their commentary on our judiciary.
I mean, it's a WhatsApp group that unfortunately has end-to-end encryption. We'll probably never actually know who stands where. But the point is, whoever leads the judiciary is going to have to deal with this. And Judge Madlanga surely knows that. Now, it's interesting that we have had hardly anything about his jurisprudence today. There's been lots of questions about his leadership, though. I would think being Chief Justice is one of those jobs where you need to be a world leader in jurisprudence. You also need to be a leader. You need to have a little bit of flair. You need to know where to make the odd comment. Sometimes, as a leader, even as a judge, you need to show a little bit of political elbow. All of those things are very difficult.
All of those things and other things besides, it's almost an endless shopping list of qualities or traits that you'd want in your Chief Justice. And then bear in mind the sort of broader national and political context. And someone argued to me that the Chief Justice you might want in 1994 may not be the same person you want in 2022. And so those factors start to play into who's the right person for this moment. What is their demographic? What is their gender? What is their jurisprudential clout, and so on. And I think really interesting to note, and just to underline, that this week really is historic. This is open competition between the President's four favorites to become Chief Justice. And it's also a time for the Judicial Service Commission to really try and cloak itself in some dignity and decorum after its shambles of an interview process last April. Sure, it did slightly better toward the end of the year when you and I last spoke, but it is a reckoning, I think, in some ways for the JSC and under an acting chair, Paula Petse.
Well, I mean, there's a lot riding on Deputy Judge President Petse. I call him Deputy Judge President because it's Deputy Judge President of the Supreme Court. I hope I've got that right.
100%.
So, I mean, chairing something like this, and I mean, I remember, old enough, grey enough to remember, Dikgang Moseneke, Deputy Chief Justice, chairing the JSC hearing of then future Chief Justice Mogoeng. I mean, that was a very grueling session. This has been quite grueling for Madlanga. I don't know if it's been quite as bad as it was for Mogoeng, though.
I mean, I think also interesting to see just how the day has proceeded in terms of maybe a bit of exhaustion or kind of very genteel introduction. And Petse, I think, doing rather well to just set up the framing and the tone and tenor for the day, and then heading toward the late afternoon and now early evening. And we'll have to see how things go the rest of the week. But you have to remember, of course, that there are the academics, there are the lawyers, there are the politicians, there are the cabinet members, all kind of getting involved in this broader interview process. And I, for one, would really not sign up to be interviewed by 22 people in a public forum in a day for the most important judicial office of the country. But that is what the four candidates are going to have to do, in addition to submitting a slew of judgments, CVs, seminar papers, for example, Madlanga referring to a seminar paper he'd written about gender issues in the judiciary. It really is just a mammoth task with a mammoth mountain load of paperwork.
It's interesting to talk about who's on the Judicial Service Commission and what their interests may be. Now, it's not always the case that people are going to vote their interests in this kind of session. In fact, members of Parliament are supposed to not really represent their party, but represent Parliament. I mean, it's a very fine distinction. We might see some case law on that at some point. But I mean, in 2008, a very long time, 14 years ago, he says, with a slight grimace, the Judicial Service Commission sat for 3 days to interview 4 candidates. They interviewed, I think, 20 judges in the end. They sat for 25 minutes and came out and told us who was on the shortlist. I don't think that can happen anymore. I think there are more factions in the JSC. How do you see it?
I think so, and I think the other thing to bear in mind is that sometimes JSC deliberations behind closed doors have been acquired afterward in terms of the record being accrued, for example, by Casac. So there is also the risk that the JSC's deliberations and debates with these different corners and different interest groups will then have that discussion scrutinized down the line. And so the JSC may well take that into account when it's sitting behind closed doors deliberating. But also you wouldn't want someone, for example, to have a list ready-made before speaking to 22 other people and deciding who is actually the best person for the job, or in this case, what are the kinds of points we want to make to the President, who, with the Chief Justice, Deputy Chief Justice and 2 heads in the appeals court, has the final say on who gets the job.
There was a shortlist that Judge Mogoeng, I believe, may have had at one point. So there's been a little bit, and there was a question from Professor Schlemmer representing academics to Judge Madlanga. In a way, it's one of these important but slightly unfair questions, because she was asking, do you believe that the way that we appoint judges should change? Now, he's now got to answer in front of the people that he's trying to impress because he wants to be appointed. But it gets to what we're trying to do here, this interface between politicians and judges. And that's what makes this unique, is that you have, in our systems, that judges are asked questions by politicians in at least one case about judgments they've written about the politician.
Right.
So then, is there a better way to manage this? Is the magic of our system, as much as we might be frustrated by it, it's transparency. We all see it.
Well, I mean, that's a really big question, and you might think there too about the panel the President introduced to advise him, the people sort of cherry-picked to participate in that process, which was almost sort of a tangent from the JSC process. Was there duplication? Was it a good idea in principle with the ethic of transparency, and things got a little sort of off the rails as we proceeded, and we're still sitting without a Chief Justice months down the line? I mean, that really is an important question. So in terms of transparency, of course, as a journalist who's trying to serve the public interest in terms of access to information, I'd love for the JSC deliberations too to be just open as a given, you know, and I think that is perhaps something to consider. The issue around saying, are we doing the right thing in how we appoint judges, is also that the Chief Justice then chairs the JSC down the line. So it's not only how are we doing in our process of choosing whether we should give you a job, but also if you get this job, how are you then going to run this process? And I do think it's very complex to work out what you need in a judicial officer. There are, of course, also questions about, you know, you might be the most amazing human being in the world, a real mensch, but are you a good jurist? And how do you balance these different priorities? And so we're going to have to see how the week progresses, not only with Madlanga, but with the other 3 candidates. And how they perform, it is a bit of a show in some ways, a bit of an arena, a public forum, open competition. But then there are these other aspects of the work that need to be considered as well.
Erin Bates, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. Don't know where you find it today. She's legal writer, of course, at Business Day newspaper. Well, more to come here from Sandton, from the Judicial Service Commission hearings, both today into this evening and, of course, tomorrow. Do stay with us on The Pulse.